Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open-source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Christian, the CEO of Artorias.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And in this episode, we are going to cover one of our most discussed topics, and is apparently the never-ending negotiations between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, and the hope, I guess, of the Trump administration to finally make this conflict end and to try to achieve a very difficult peace treaty. For our listeners who probably are not tracking this as intimately as possible, a couple weeks ago, what seemed out of the blue and out of nowhere, Axios was the first to report it, and then it was backed up by various news agencies, that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy, managed to reach an agreement with the Russians of a, quote, 28-point peace plan. That once it got leaked, it was pretty clear that the 28-point peace plan was basically Russia's maximalist demands. It didn't seem as something new, but the Russians, and it maybe in some degree Witkoff, were trying to throw this as peace of our times. Maybe that's fair criticism, maybe it's too harsh, but that was the immediate impression we got. Obviously, Ukraine and our European allies were very concerned, if not outright furious with this detail, and wanted to expand these negotiations to ensure that it was much more closely aligned to Ukrainian and European interests. When the 28-point peace plan was announced after Witkoff was meeting with key Russian figures, the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, went to Kyiv, which was an already pre-planned visit to discuss about the U.S. Army's plans to acquire Ukrainian drones and technology, also introduced the peace plan to Dan Driscoll. And originally the plan was for Zelensky to have a meeting with Witkoff in Istanbul to continue negotiation, but that was quickly nixed. What followed was a series of in-depth negotiations between the United States, our European allies, and Ukraine in Geneva, which managed to reduce the 28-point peace plan to a 19-point peace plan, probably much more closely aligned to the original plan that the United States and Ukraine agreed upon. The Russians demanded, as most other maximalists demand, and one of the major sticking points, was that Ukraine had to pull out of the entire Donetsk Oblast, which for the Ukrainian is their most fortified region that they've been able to hold the Russians since basically 2014, and it capped the Ukrainian military to approximately around 400,000 soldiers, which is about half its current size right now. In Geneva, the negotiations were now led by Secretary of State and Interim National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, with also the presence of Steve Witkoff, Ukrainian officials, and our European allies. That 19-point peace plan, the agreement was that the ceasefire was going to be in effect and the front lines were going to freeze, and that Ukraine was able to maintain the army size to around 800,000, more or less their current ratio right now. Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner then went to Moscow and even met President Putin directly in the Kremlin to try to have a negotiation. And those negotiations lasted for around 5 hours. And what was noteworthy of that visit, similar to what we saw in Anchorage, Alaska, when President Trump met President Putin, is that both sides basically did not have grand communiques as saying that there's successful negotiations. And the Russians basically rejected the 19-point peace plan as saying it was out of touch and not meeting their requirements. As of this recording today, on Friday, December 5th, we did get additional reporting that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were currently meeting with Ukrainian officials in Miami to continue the negotiations and give the opportunities for the Ukrainians to get a readout of Steve Witkoff's and Jared Kushner's negotiations with the Russians to include President Putin. And that's currently where we're at right now. It seems like this is a never-ending cycle where Russia continues to press maximalist demands to halt the invasion. The Ukrainians are trying to reach a ceasefire, and President Trump and the Trump administration appears to be stuck in the middle between an immovable object and an unstoppable force that only allows war to continue, which clearly the Trump administration does not want. But right now, that's the reality on the ground. So with that, Christian, I feel like in many aspects, we might be able to just grab a previous recording, repeat it, let our listeners listen to that, Because it just seems like Groundhog Day, where we're just in this never-ending cycle of negotiations, and nothing really is going to go on. So go ahead, Christian.
Usually I would have like sentences and sentences built up to talk about this, but yeah, as you say, um, if this was more of a fun podcast, it wasn't so serious, I probably would take the moment just to like take the last 3 episodes and like stitch them together and just put them after your intro right there, and then just that be the episode. But I think there's more to be to be talked about in this regard, but not in the sense of like, okay, this negotiation happens, but like what happens with the Europeans and our allies in NATO, and our allies in the Pacific and so forth, if there is a larger war at play somewhere down the line, and what does this instill to our other partners? Because like if you look at like the United States as like a whole sense, and this is to be said about the US in more of a broad context than just the Russia-Ukraine war, because this is typically how it works. Our allies typically work with whatever admin comes in, and that's pretty much what happens during that admin. And there is some understanding that little things are going to change between alliances and stuff with new admins coming and going. And that's kind of the common practice across the board for most treaties and alliances and even unspoken trust things like Taiwan, for example. It just kind of goes without saying that there will be small, minute things that change. But overall, like, the US is pretty steadfast in our missions up until this administration. I think this sets a very bad precedent, no matter how well this goes or if it falls apart entirely. In a hypothetical world where Witkoff, fucking Jared Kushner for some fucking reason, and Putin himself come to a fucking agreement on what's going to happen with Ukraine, like, okay, cool, everybody claps their hands, but like, I don't think the Europeans are just going to like agree to whatever fucking the US says at this point. Like at this rate, we are such a laughing stock on the geopolitical stage that it's like, it's almost kind of a meme at this point. Like seeing a fucking slumlord go and meet with fucking Putin of all people and be like, hey, this is the new lay of the land. Here's how we should carve up the Donbass. Like he has any sort of fucking experience being a geopolitical leader in any fucking regard. Like I'd rather take like some lowly high school student that's like might be able to get admitted into fucking into any school that follows geopolicy. I was gonna say like John Hopkins or something, but even that would be a fucking stretch. I'd much rather somebody trying to get to like fucking New York State trying to get a fucking undergrad in geopolitics than fucking Kushner being on the table. But whatever. I'm fucking preaching to the choir on this panel, but at least for like how this affects downstream events for the rest of the fucking US history, like this is a cataclysmic failure. A cataclysmic failure. I sent you something really funny yesterday, Stefano. I'm pretty sure in regards to this. I might have sent it to you, Matt, in our like little group chat of like and it's all fucking Trump quotes. Like before he became president, it was like, "I'll end the war in 24 hours," and he becomes a clown. Like more of a clown is getting ready. Yeah, it's that meme, but it's like, "I'll end the war in 24 hours. I'll end the war in 100 days. This is Biden's war." And then the final one is full clown face, and he says, "Putin, do whatever the fuck you want." Like that is an embodiment of this. As they go back and forth and nothing is done, things are increasingly being put into the hands of Putin and exactly what he's looking for and exactly what he wants. And I mean, and I know I've harped on it fucking 3 episodes now at this point, or even more, but like the foundation that's being created for this is like fucking incredible. But if you look back at the history of the Trump administration previously and their ties to Moscow, even before Trump won his 2016 presidency, like the fucking, the hens were already painted at that point. We already knew what they were going to look like. So is it that much of a surprise? Not really. I mean, I was fucking hoping that there would be some sort of change. Like I was really banking, and you guys, if you are a longtime listener of the podcast, know that I was like very steadfast on this idea of like there will be a point when Trump gets really frustrated and he'll betray Putin. But at this point, like I'm not seeing that fucking happening. Like if anything, like Putin does something bad, Trump gets mad about it for a day or two, completely flips back to being Trump's fucking baby daddy. Like it just like there's no fucking there's no like attrition, there's no hatred, there's no conflict, there's no anything, there's no back and forth, there's no oh you drone strike this fucking hospital, dude. Like we're now going to use this against you from the negotiations or whatever. Like nothing's used. Like it's all fucking hearsay. You get like the best Trump reactions we get out of the fucking Russia thing aren't official press conferences. I will attest. They're like when Trump's on Air Force One, like on a long trip that has nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia, and he'll make a comment about, oh yeah, Melania said that the school was targeted by Russia. That's very bad. Putin's really disappointing me. Blah blah blah. And then fucking the next day, it's like, yeah. So Putin wants the entire Donbass region. Russia, I agree. Ukraine can either withdraw or Putin is going to decimate all your troops in the Donbass. Like that's the narrative that's being laid out. And if I was like Taiwan in this moment and I was looking at this whole fucking debacle, then I would be looking at my own defense and I would not be looking at the US as a partner. Like I'd be meeting with fucking Australia every day. I'd be meeting with New Zealand every day. I'd be meeting with South Korea every day. I would be nesting this like cabal of being like, I don't think the U.S. Navy is going to help us, guys. And even if they do, they're going to fucking betray us 2 years later anyway. So what the fuck's even the point of taking their assistance in the first place? Why make ourselves so fucking reliant? During like the beginning of the fall, mid-fall, we saw Trump kind of move Indian Prime Minister Modi kind of in a direction that was more U.S. aligned. That's fallen apart over the last 3 weeks. I'm not sure if anybody on this panel saw that, but like that's completely fallen apart. Now Modi is like, oh, yeah, we'll just buy Russian arms and shit. Like, what's even the fucking point of like aligning ourselves with the fucking U.S. interest if the U.S. is going to choose the Russian interest at the end of the day? But I digress. I could go on about this for a multitude of minutes, but I feel like giving the panel back to you, Stefano, maybe to ask another question or maybe get Matt's opinion. I'm not sure.
No, yeah, and I'll go to Matt, and I think what you're highlighting is just this exacerbation, and what I find interesting though, before I go to you, Matt, I do believe that in a sense, obviously, President Trump is kind of the commander in chief, and he dictates policy, but I think we are seeing kind of two camps, right? If you compare it to the first Trump administration, for the most part within the cabinet, and even the vice president, you had much more of the Russia hawks with certain elements of more friendlier people to Russia. And that's when we saw the javelins be sent to Ukraine and something they love to tout, et cetera. And here, in this current Trump administration, I think you see a lot more of the pro, let's say, Russia camp in the Trump administration, viewing Russia not necessarily as a geopolitical rival or just threat, but more somebody that either as a nuisance or somebody that we can even do business dealing. And I think the two camps are kind of epitomized by one is the Vice President J.D. Vance, who clearly is taking a much more hawkish and aggressive approach against Ukraine than with Russia. And I think in that camp you can consider, Steve Witkoff, who I think is very clear. I think it was Bloomberg that reported the calls and the conversation that he was having with Russian envoy, specifically Kirill Dmitriev, which was just outrageous. And for our listeners who don't know, there were, first of all, Steve Witkoff was having conversations with the Russian envoy via WhatsApp, which is just insanity because that can easily be tracked and listened into. And what Steve Witkoff was basically saying to Kirill Dmitriev, who was the special Russian envoy that, officially, unofficially has aligned to President Putin, is up to debate, but clearly it's kind of the face that the U.S. used for negotiations. Steve Witkoff was saying to the Russian envoy, what are the talking points he needs to say to President Trump to get, back into the favor of President Trump? Because specifically when this was happening was when President Trump was considering selling Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. And then President Zelensky went to the White House, and the idea was the Tomahawk cruise missiles were going to be announced. And then President Trump did not agree to sell them. And it looks like Steve Witkoff managed to do this. And it was kind of this sense of betrayal in many aspects because that hawkish approach didn't continue. One of the things that we did see was very successful was the U.S. Treasury did impose very severe sanctions against major Russian oil companies that have had an impact on the Russian oil economy. I think there was some extensions of some of the sanctions specifically for local oil gas stations operating outside of Russia have some exemptions that are going to continue. But at least in that spent, the sanctions have been very crippling on the Russians, but the armament piece stopped. And I think that's kind of one camp. But I think the other camp we're seeing that is still kind of this Russia hawk, views Russia as a geopolitical threat, is basically, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's basically on his own. I mean, he doesn't have the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, obviously on the side. Pete Hegseth has had absolutely no involvement in Russia-Ukraine for all that matter. And I think this is basically Marco Rubio, where you see when he went to Geneva and started to lead the negotiations, he managed to get a 19-point peace plan, much more favorable or aligned to kind of Ukraine's and the Europeans' positions. But right now, unlike the first Trump administration, that pro-Ukraine, more pro-transatlantic view Russia as a threat is kind of isolated. And I found it very interesting, Marco Rubio's interview with Sean Hannity yesterday, because one of the comments he kind of made was, and he's trying to do this balancing act. You can say, well, there's the territorial dispute is 30, 50 kilometers, which is still massive because that's the entire fortified positions that Ukraine relies on to halt the Russian advance. But his argument was, and I think this is what he wants to entrench Ukraine as a pro-American and pro-European, was he made this comment that in 10 years, theoretically, Ukraine's economy can be greater than Russia. And I think that's kind of the angle he's taking. But I think he's a lone voice within this administration that has been basically filled with characters who openly discuss ways with the Russians and how to win back Trump's favor, not even from a policy perspective, but basically advising, lobbying the Russians and, hey, this is how you can make sure Trump doesn't give Tomahawk cruise missiles, completely bypassing the National Security Council, how it was done in the past, and how foreign policy is dictated, is basically how can you do that? And one of the comments, for example, he said was, you got to really leverage the Israel-Gaza ceasefire agreement, which for our listeners, that war is still going on. There's not a lot of conflict going on. They love to say the ceasefire is still in effect. Conflict still happens in Israel, Gaza. And another key point, yesterday, Trump touted the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda signing a peace treaty. Just for our listeners to know, the M23 rebels that are backed by Rwanda launched another offensive today in South Kivu, continuing the violence there. So that war is still going on. But this is kind of the area that how Steve Witkoff is operating. And I think this pro-Russia camp within the second Trump administration has a lot of influence that is making the life difficult for both Ukraine and Europe. But Matt, I'll go to you. What is your kind of initial reaction to this? Is just the never-ending negotiations that are just enough for Putin to continue to war without suffering devastating more sanctions or weapons delivery?
I mean, I've got a few takeaways. It does really just seem like, again, this flip-flopping that we see from the Trump administration in terms of what their policy actually is. And it's a concession, like you were saying, from what we've seen to those maximalist goals that uh, Russia has been very steadfast in, without really explaining what's changed, other than potentially opportunities for corruption from some of the people within Trump's orbit. I think the key points that I'm looking at is the fact that we have sidelined, by and large, our allies in Europe. There was very little NATO coordination in the creation of this plan. And you can see that by sort of the counterproposal that the European capitals put together. For example, removing the territorial gains that are given to Russia, or deleting the cap on Ukraine's military. So it's clear to me that Europe is not on board with what's been proposed by the United States. And a lot of this is happening through back channels, unofficial channels, but not even established ones necessarily. We know that in the past, someone like Kushner has had been caught using things like WhatsApp. There's a security risk in the way they're going about this. The leaks about the coaching is really abhorrent, and that's not the type of thing that you would expect from a diplomat. And you have to keep in mind, they're not diplomats. They don't have any experience in this. And what it looks like to me is they're seeing this as an opportunity for enrichment, personal enrichment, and the enrichment of, at this point, unnamed backers for the reconstruction project that would come out of this plan. Now, part of that is the unfreezing of Russian assets, and those would then be put into a US-led investment fund. And there is a clause in this deal that would allow for 50% of those profits um, to go to US investors. That to me is just blatant corruption using, I mean, you could even call it like profiteering. And that's not a motivation that you want the people who are at the negotiating table to have. Not if you're an ally of Ukraine, which the US has traditionally considered itself. And you've got someone like Jared Kushner who has this Saudi wealth fund at his disposal. Um, it really, to me, it reeks of corruption. It seems incredibly inappropriate that these are the people that we have sitting at the table. And, it's kind of a side note, but they also allowed Belarus to weasel its way back onto the national stage. They don't show any sort of coherent plan. And what has come out of this, especially with things like the territorial concessions, is a system that rewards the aggressor. And so when you have these revisionist states, be it Russia or China, looking to expand, if they see that we are more than willing to allow that, as long as they stick to their guns, then we lose that deterrence that we've traditionally had.
One thing I'll add that I found very interesting, and I do not recall which news agency reported this, but it was, I believe, a British diplomat kind of made this very interesting comment about Steve Witkoff. And the comment was along the lines that Steve Witkoff, was a real estate agent, I believe, in New York. And so everything in his mind is kind of this, as you alluded to, kind of transactional. But more importantly, if you're doing from an economic perspective and an economic negotiation, is that everybody wants to go get a deal. The question is in the finer details of how to get there. And what he was alluding to in diplomacy and political negotiations, that's not always the case. That sometimes you negotiate just to draw out the process and not suffer the worst consequences, but that doesn't mean you want a deal. And what he was saying is Steve Witkoff apparently doesn't understand that. He cannot comprehend that he is being played. And I think not only does he want to be played, but he wants to be part of this process for whatever personal motives he might have. But that the Russians are not interested in ending this war. They have no interest in doing that. What they're trying to do is draw this out as long as possible without having the United States continue to send more military equipment. Now, granted, the sanctions announced against Rosneft and Lukoil have been very effective and caused significant problems to the Russian economy and to their ability to generate profit for the budget. We've seen the Russian Ministry of Economy already released statements of how they're going to try to make up for the lost revenues. Today, I think they even announced a significant increase on their taxes for alcohol and other ways to try to make up for the budget shortfall they're going to suffer. But I think what the problem is Steve Witkoff just does not understand, or he doesn't want to, that the Russians are not going into these negotiations to reach a deal. That's not their end state. This isn't an economic business dealing. It's a completely different ballgame. And I think this is one of the major problems we're running into within the Trump administration, the gunning of the State Department and the National Security Council, is that you do not have the people who understand these talking points, who understand how these diplomatic negotiations work, and that sometimes they do it just to let the process drag out. Matt, I'll go back to you, but I do want to share an additional note. This is from the Kyiv Post. That was published today, recently, actually shortly when we started recording, is that the United States promises basically a pre-Christmas arms boost for Ukraine. However, they are pushing for Europe to kind of have much more of a leading role into NATO by 2025. And basically that the intent is that the United States will send much more military equipment to Ukraine before Christmas to kind of continue their armament and their ability to defend. against Russia. I think it's important to know that Pokrovsk, I mean, the Russians claim they seized it completely. The Ukrainians are saying they still have elements of Pokrovsk under their control, specifically in the northern outskirts. But I think for most intents and purposes, if you kind of really look at the map, it's a matter of when, not if, Pokrovsk falls. And it's really been a very dire situation for the Ukrainians to hold on to that territory. However, they have been able to inflict significant amount of casualties on the Russians to seize it. So I think this arms shipment will be very effective for Ukraine. We have seen some of that. During the government shutdown, they said a lot of the arms shipment were halted because of the government shutdown. I think it would be very important to see that kind of continue up. Obviously, Europe has been picking up most of the military aid already to Ukraine, but I think a lot of this back and forth from a negotiation perspective is kind of creating issues where a lot of NATO countries are saying, why are we going to buy? Because the deal that they had with NATO and the US was NATO was going to purchase American weapons to then ship over to Ukraine. We've seen the Italians say, well, if the Americans are much more interested in peace negotiation, why would we buy their weapons to send it to Ukraine? We might as well just do it bilaterally with our own armed manufacturer. And I think what Steve Witkoff is not noticing and Jared Kushner is this back and forth is hampering our ability of the U.S. to continue to get very lucrative weapons deals to send to the Ukrainians and actually impacting a U.S. arms export, because now Europe, as not viewing us a reliable partner, are not going to buy U.S. weapons if there's a concern of war happens that we might halt arms shipment like we did to Ukraine. So, again, the short-term negotiations is having long-term military and economic impacts to the United States. But Matt, I'll go back to you.
Well, and kind of you finished there exactly in the direction that I was going to go with that, which was just to add that while Putin is really playing the diplomats that the United States is sending, and really isn't giving up anything, and the United States, is seemingly going along with that, and the damage that can do to US policy and the relationships with our allies is also very beneficial to Russia. The longer they keep up this back and forth, this Groundhog Day, as you were saying, it just makes it clear that this administration is not a reliable partner. And this is gonna have lasting effects on our alliances, and on NATO. And we could continue to see the gap between our European partners and the United States grow. And that is not just detrimental here. That can also become detrimental in the future in other areas, other spheres. So if you're talking about things like intelligence sharing, that could be a huge blow because we're not seen as reliable. And we know that some of our allies are really taking a close look at what information is being shared with the United States. So again, that benefits Russia, not just in the situation in Ukraine, but also in other spheres where they've extended their influence.
No, I think one of the aspects that I really believe that the issue we're running into is it's kind of like it's an interesting dynamic where Marco Rubio has to kind of step into, he says that the points that need to be achieved, we need a peace treaty, we need a ceasefire, we need to do this, agreeing like a lot of this is America's plan, et cetera. And then when he actually gets into the negotiations and kind of behind closed doors, he's able to kind of make these peace treaties and these peace negotiations much more favorable to Ukraine. And the irony of the situation, then he kind of hands that off to Steve Witkoff, and it's like, okay, well, you go negotiate with the Russians because this is the deal now that's on the table. And now, and I think that's the situation we saw. I think, Steve Witkoff, when he had this, this deal, this 28-point peace plan that was in effect, and this idea that Ukraine, it was very favorable to Russia, and the Ukrainians would have to accept it no matter what. I think Marco Rubio going to Geneva managed to really walk a lot of that away from the administration's perspective. And now we did see these 5-hour negotiations that Steve Witkoff had with Jared Kushner. We didn't see kind of this piece of our time. We reached an agreement. The Russians were pretty upset. And I'm wondering if the Russians might even start viewing at other players to kind of continue this negotiation track, because Marco Rubio is able to kind of at least ensure that the worst case scenario doesn't go to fruition, and he's able to push that within the administration, say, no, this is kind of the deal, much more favorable to Ukraine, security guarantees, et cetera, and kind of walk that away, and kind of much more of a diplomatic approach in a sense. And I mean, the irony of the situation is, Marco Rubio, I think since Henry Kissinger is the only time that we had a Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in the same position, right? And I think Marco Rubio has the ability to be much more influential if he's able to take the reign. And I think that's kind of what came out of the Steve Witkoff story. The Steve Witkoff negotiations, the 28-point peace plan at the beginning, really caught a lot of people by surprise. And I think the kind of the hidden star that's not being talked about a lot is Marco Rubio, and then to an extent, we did see briefly. We'll see if this kind of continues. Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll, right? I mean, he is somebody who has not been such a political operative within the Department of War, Department of Defense, been much more focus, Army centric, Army focused. He did take this as an additional step when he was there to kind of this negotiations. He did go to the UAE to kind of continue the negotiations with the Russians and the Ukrainians. That seems to kind of stop. And I'm wondering if maybe Marco Rubio is trying to reinsert the State Department into a lot of this and to try to ensure that there's just some planning and organization aspect in this chaos of negotiations, and nothing comes out of the blue, because that causes issues with Europe and Ukraine. And maybe that's the silver lining in this chaos, is that we might see Marco Rubio be much more effective as America's voice from a diplomatic sense. And Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are now being told, this is the deal that's on the table for the Russians. You have to find a way to negotiate it through. That's the only silver lining I'm seeing. I don't know how many times Steve Witkoff can pull this off. Let's recall when Trump was very furious with Russia. Steve Witkoff went to St. Petersburg, and he was the reason why Anchorage, Alaska happened, right? Which was a huge embarrassment for President Trump, and probably the closest we ever got to President Trump being the much more hawkish against Russia, before Steve Witkoff did it again and try to throw in a 28-point peace plan. It's like this very continuous, interesting cycle, very repetitive, in which every time the Trump administration is going to take a very hawkish approach, Steve Witkoff shows up out of nowhere to say peace is available, peace is imminent, we're going to achieve it within a week, and for all that to just fall apart. So I'm wondering if now Steve Witkoff realized he can't do this indefinitely, and maybe Marco Rubio is able to insert himself a little bit more into this. But Christian, I'll go to you in that process. Do you think, is it a better scenario with Marco Rubio leading these negotiations, trying to tame or control Steve Witkoff's, basically diplomatic endeavors, where throws everything into chaos? What do you think?
I don't think Rubio has any sort of effect on this, in all honesty. I don't think him leading it or being secondary to it really changes anything, in my honest opinion. I mean, that's just like a short way of answering that. I think he sold his soul when he joined this admin. I feel like he took it because it was a really good promotion for him, and it's kind of just been that, and like looking at his political career, it was kind of that. Like he lived it out. He had what he had. He was never going to become president. At least he doesn't have the name state to fight a Republican ticket by himself. I think he took this job and he's kind of just a pushover. That's my genuine, honest opinion. I know we were super optimistic, at least on this panel, when he was added in, just because like he definitely has the gravitas and the expertise from a geopolitical perspective. But over this 13 months now, not even 13 months actually, excuse me. 13 months really until Trump was elected, but coming up on not even 11 months now. That being said, excuse my French, but yeah, that's where we're at. I mean, he's a fucking pushover, and yeah, I don't think it changes anything at all.
And from my point of view, he comes off as reactive. So he's not there in the room like a lot of the times it would appear. And we know that he really bothered a lot of the NATO countries because he didn't even bother showing up to the meeting with the foreign ministers where they were expecting some clarity on what was going on. I think these quotes that we get from Rubio are sort of just window dressing to um, make it seem like there's some coherence or some voice of reason, but he clearly does not have the pull.
I think his ability to um I think his inability to go to the NATO summit my impression of that is more because of the situation in Venezuela, which I think Marco Rubio is much more passionate about, if that's the word I can use. Clearly, that has been a focus of his very, very significantly against Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan dictator. Clearly, they sent the Deputy Secretary of State, who, based on reporting that we got, just basically threw a fit to the Europeans, saying you can't exclude U.S. weapons if you're doing rearmament. Then the counter to that is, well, probably not bash the Europeans 24/7 and demand that they do rearmament. They have to do rearmament. They need to increase their own weapons production. So it's just this natural thing. It's important to know. I will highlight. Today we did get a report that the United States agreed to provide $3 billion sale to Denmark to increase their air defense capabilities and their air awareness domain for Denmark. And so that we do see continuation of this. I'm very interested to see, kind of based on this report from Kyiv Post that did while we were recording this quote unquote, weapons pre-Christmas weapons surge, what that actually looks like. And I'm also wondering if there's a situation where we go back to a much more hawkish approach from the Trump administration because the negotiations continue to just drag on and drag on. Do we see this idea of maybe the Tomahawk cruise missiles come back into light? We did see the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, like as I mentioned before. Is this kind of the next step that we see, at least from a messaging perspective, for Ukraine to do it? I think President Zelensky has learned and knows how to manage the situation. Um, that is clear as day. He knows how to ensure and alleviate the kind of this rush for peace from the Trump administration. He finds ways to not shoot it down, but be much more diplomatic and smart about it, and ensure that his overall objectives are still met and his demands are taken into account, and that he's not forced to capitulate in one way or another to kind of Trump's demands for immediate peace, even if that means giving up more territory that the Ukrainians have been fighting for. So I think President Zelensky is in a better situation now than he was, let's say, in February, when he had to deal with the second Trump administration in the beginning. I think he's much more successful, and he relies on his European allies. One of the concerning developments we got, obviously, is when the Europeans started to have conversation with President Zelensky. It's reported that President Macron of France basically accused the Americans, you got to be careful because the Americans are going to betray you. He said that to Zelensky, and they try to do this whole of Europe approach to ensure that didn't happen. And I think Geneva, where Marco Rubio stepped in, managed to prevent that. So I would agree with you, Matt. I do believe he's much more reactive. The question that I would have and throw to you is, when do we start seeing him being much more proactive, and we start seeing kind of these diplomatic endeavors from Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner? And I would put probably more Steve Witkoff being secondary, and Marco Rubio being able to lead it. Because look, all administrations rely on special envoys. They play a key role. We can look at, for example, a very successful special envoy in this current administration, Tom Barak, right? I mean, he has been, the U.S. ambassador for Turkey, who is the U.S. special envoy for Syria. I think he's been, even with the kind of the trying to pull their hair in dealing with Benjamin Netanyahu, been very successful in ensuring a stable relationship between the United States and the new Syrian government. There's a lot of promises. Looks very positive. Obviously, Tom Barak has taken a much more, let's say, diplomatic tone, but in the background has been much more hawkish against the Israelis to stop conducting just all these strikes in Syria and destabilize the new Syrian government, and try to ensure that Syria and Israel have either a non-aggression pact or even a peace treaty, right, where it's solidified and codified. And I think that's one example where we've seen success, even again with the problems that they have to run into with Benjamin Netanyahu. Which one of my favorite quotes is from Axios from a senior U.S. official basically said Benjamin Netanyahu sees ghosts everywhere, and that's why he's operating that way. And one of the areas that I think they're trying to maybe alleviate Benjamin Netanyahu saying, okay, don't conduct indiscriminate strikes against Syria, but you have free reign in Lebanon against Hezbollah. And we're seeing Israel do that. So that's a key aspect where a special envoy has been very successful. Steve Witkoff, if we're analyzing it from Israel, Gaza, you know, much more success, let's say, in trying to stop the war, maintain the alliance with Israel, but putting a halt at Israel's and Benjamin Netanyahu's aggressive demands and being able to at least try to achieve a ceasefire with how complex that is and how difficult that is. But we never necessarily seen Steve Witkoff play this, let's say, pro one side or another narrative indefinitely. For some reason, when we're dealing with Russia, it's a completely different conversation. I mean, you cannot look at Steve Witkoff and say he's a neutral envoy. Every single time we see a plan, every single time we hear him talk, every single time he talks to the media or presents a peace plan, it is pro-Russian. It is the Russian narrative, 100%. At some point, do we see Steve Witkoff removed from the Russian portfolio and somebody else put in there? Because General Kellogg, the U.S. envoy for Ukraine, has been completely removed from this process. And there's reporting that he's going to leave the administration in January, which would be a huge loss for Ukraine. So the question is, who's taking that next position? Is that position going to be filled by somebody else? Ideally, we see somebody else. But I think Steve Witkoff needs to be completely removed from the Russian portfolio and focus on his title, which is Special Envoy for the Middle East, where at that point, you know, he's dealing with a complex situation and is probably much more neutral in that. But in this Russia-Ukraine one, I think he's burned way too many bridges, not only with Ukraine, but more importantly, our European allies.
Yeah, so I think there are a few different ways that we could see that happen. One would be domestically, the optics of the deal, and the conversation around it, potentially in the media or other forms, focuses or continues to focus and elaborate on sort of the corruption elements of the deal. If this is seen as sort of self-enriching by Trump, his allies, specifically Witkoff, that could lead to domestic pressure, political pressure. But what I think maybe is a little bit more realistic, especially the more times that we see this happen, the more times that he has come up with deals that don't really go anywhere. Eventually, I think there's going to be sort of interagency friction, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what we're seeing now. But if from within the Pentagon, the NSC, or State Department, if they are going through and trying to sort of slow roll any of these proposals, leak information that might be damaging to Witkoff, it could be frustrating to Trump, and I do think that a lot of this is Witkoff trying to get what he can out of Russia for his personal gain and Trump's personal gain. And again, all of those people in that sort of close-knit group. But at what point does this become too much of a headache for Trump? And then the other thing that you could do is look at like congressional buy-in. So any sort of peace deal that would need like appropriations from Congress for like reconstruction or changes to like sanctions regimes, and then obviously we would need some sort of ratification of the security guarantee that would have to go through Congress. And I don't think that Witkoff is well suited to sell that package or to make those deals or to get the votes. And I think sort of what we've seen in Congress recently with some of these upheavals of going against like Speaker Johnson or forcing the vote on different matters like Epstein, for example. I don't know if they'd be able to whip those votes without someone with that type of experience, and someone with that type of experience and sort of that gravitas that comes with being Secretary of State would be Rubio. So those are some of the scenarios, and it could be a combination of all of those coming together that might lead to sort of a switch in strategy in terms of who is doing the negotiations.
I think the congressional piece is key, and we do see bipartisan outrage when the 28-point peace plan was announced. There was bipartisan outrage, and even reporting that GOP Congressman Ron Bacon from Nebraska was willing to resign his seat immediately, which would put Speaker Johnson in a very precarious situation after losing Major Taylor Greene. So I do agree the congressional piece is a very important piece. Christian?
Yeah, and like that's a very good point, Matt. I guess the flip to that is, and I know you highlighted it earlier, Stefano, in regards to Israel and Palestine, but like here we are, I guess hindsight will always be 2020. We don't actually know what the future will hold. Um, I don't think the statement I'm about to say is going to bite me though. Is okay. We agree for whatever terms, right? Let's just say Trump's the almighty leader. Whatever he says will get congressional approval. The Europeans will be on board. Everything will be fucking happy dory, and everybody will be singing kumbaya. All right, that day happens. Do we actually believe Russia will fall through with that peace plan? Probably not. And I think that's a very bipartisan agreement, and there's no country specific view on that. I think everybody across the board genuinely believes that no matter what, Russia will renege on that peace plan at some point. And if that's the case, does that put us into a situation where we see with Israel and Palestine, which, okay, yeah, I mean, that's definitely you highlighted, like strikes are still happening. Like whether they want to call that a ceasefire or not, it's not a fucking ceasefire. People are still dying left and right every week. That being said, the Trump administration, since they did that, have completely ignored that entire region for the most part. Like they don't even follow the conflict because it doesn't fit their narrative. And I feel as if there's something to be said about that occurring in Ukraine. And I do agree with Matt's point very deeply that this is for the self enrichment of the people at the top of the Trump administration that are dealing with this issue. It is how can we take as much money and as much resources off the table with this conflict? And I would not be surprised behind closed doors, Putin's promising allowing the Trump administration to go in there and have rights over specific areas and so forth. Like I would not put it past them. I mean, left and right, like this administration, the only thing they really give a fuck about is their own personal gain. And they keep proving that time after time. I really try to stay as apolitical as possible on these podcast episodes, but like that's a genuine opinion of mine. That's not based in policy. It's based on what we're seeing. I mean, the fucking crypto scams and everything else, even to his own fucking constituents, is retarded, if you ask me. And like, I don't think that this is any different from those. This is how can Witkoff, Kushner, and Trump make the most gains out of this? I think if they went into this peace plan and it was Rubio and Lavrov speaking one-on-one every week, and we were trying to figure out what the Russians want and what the US wants and what Ukraine wants, I would actually be in a place to believe that these are genuine pushes for peace. But at least for where we stand currently, I just don't see it. I don't see why Witkoff and Kushner are the people that we are putting in charge of what is arguably the biggest geopolitical event since World War II at this point. And we're allowing two real estate guys from New York to fucking operate that. It just makes zero sense to me unless it is entirely focused on monetary gain for them specifically as people or the Trump administration as a whole. And I just don't see a reality in which they are acting in the interests of the people of the United States. I will remind everybody and the listeners here, these are not people that the United States has ever voted on. These are people that Trump has appointed to do these tasks. And they don't have a legitimate fucking track record of doing anything well for this country. So where does it lay? You know what I mean? Like if if Jared Kushner is having fucking hundreds of lawsuits thrown at him over the last 2 decades for not fixing fucking rental properties he owns in Manhattan, do you really trust him to fix the largest geopolitical issue on earth for the betterment of society? I just don't fucking buy it. I just don't fucking buy it. And I don't think the Europeans buy it. I don't think Ukraine buys it. But at this point in time, and at least for the next, I would say 6 to 12 months, as the Europeans continue to ramp up their own arms development and monetary policy alignment towards Ukraine to kind of supplement the US's lack thereof, I think they are really beholden to the US. And I think it's going to be a continuation of the crumbling of the US power on the world stage. And it is a fundamental disaster, not just for the United States, not just for Ukraine, but I believe the entire world. Because Russia right now and Xi Jinping and China are all seeing this play out, and they know that no matter what they do, as long as they fight a war of attrition and they have a population that will support it, the West will fucking cave. And it is blistering for me to see. And the United States, at least in its current state, has the power, for all intents and purposes, to kind of veto European troops going into Ukraine to assist. And obviously, we would have to wait and see how that plays out. But at least in its current state, how things are aligned, the U.S. has a lot of veto power in that regard. And if Witkoff is at the helm of this ship, I also legitimately believe they are at the helm of the policy on the day-to-day, as well as the armaments and everything. And they have the ability to be like, hey guys, hey Europe, let's halt some things here so Russia doesn't escalate further. And then that's kind of where I was at when we were on the last couple of these, is really focused on that point, which is Trump living in this fantasy, this Reagan era fantasy, that Russia could destroy us at any moment? At this point in time, I don't know if he legitimately believes that, or if he's just so fucking blinded by his own gilded image that he might be able to make off with this.
Well, I think, again, something else that happened while we were doing this, to kind of piggyback on that, we did just get a readout from Steve Witkoff on their meeting today in Miami. And I think it's an important thing to read for our listeners to have an understanding, because today in Miami, Steve Witkoff was meeting with Ukrainian representative, and I think it's important to read it. It's a little bit long, but I think it's important to kind of go out. So this is from the official government account of Special Envoy Steve Witkoff at SE Peace Missions. He said, readout of meeting between Special Envoy for Peace Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Ukraine's Secretary of National Security and Defense Council Rustem Umerov, and Chief of General Staff General Andrei Kanaitov. Over 2 days, Special Envoy for Peace Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with the Ukrainian Secretary of National Security and Defense Council and the Chief of General Staff of Ukraine for constructive discussions on advancing a credible pathway towards a durable and just peace in Ukraine. Today, the group had their 6th meeting over the past 2 weeks. Secretary Umerov reaffirmed that Ukraine's priority is securing a settlement that protects its independence and sovereignty, ensures the safety of Ukrainians, and provides a stable foundation for a prosperous democratic future. The participants discussed the result of recent meetings of the American side with Russians and steps that could lead to ending the war. The Americans and Ukrainians also agreed on the framework of security arrangements and discussed necessary deterrence capabilities to sustain a lasting peace. I think that's the key point right there, is the last sentence. The American and Ukrainians also agreed on the framework of security arrangements and, more importantly, and discussed the necessary deterrence capabilities to sustain a lasting peace. I'm hoping what that means is, based on the reporting that we got from the Kyiv Post, that we are going to see an increase of U.S. weapons to Ukraine, because now there's hopefully an understanding, and maybe it finally Go ahead.
I know what you're getting at, dude, but if you read not the next paragraph, but the paragraph after that, he literally says and this is one of the last things said in this entire statement, by the way. Parties also separately reviewed the future prosperity agenda, which aims to support Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, joint U.S.-Ukraine economic initiatives, and long-term recovery projects. Here's the fact of the matter. If they can achieve peace before the end of the Trump administration, the likes of Kushner, the likes of Witkoff, the likes of Trump will all become a lot wealthier because of it. Right? But if the peace goes past that point, they are not included at that fucking table. There's no place in the world where Ukraine's like, yeah, Trump, you can come back to the drawing table and work with us on the reconstruction of our country.
So let me finish that. Yeah. So both parties agreed that real progress towards any agreement depends on Russia's readiness to show serious commitment to long-term peace, including step towards de-escalation and cessation of killing. Parties also, as you alluded to, also separately reviewed the future prosperity agenda, which aims to support Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, joint U.S. economic initiatives, and long-term recovery projects. American and Ukrainian parties underscored that an end to war and credible steps towards ceasefire and de-escalation are necessary to prevent renewed aggression and to enable Ukraine's comprehensive redevelopment plan designed to make the nation stronger and more prosperous than before the war. Parties will reconvene tomorrow to continue advancing the discussions. I mean, look, maybe, again, this is just a Twitter post from the official government account. You know, we all know public diplomacy doesn't necessarily mean what's actually happening in the ground, actually never means what's actually happening in the background. Maybe the article that Bloomberg released that more than likely came because the Europeans, a European nation, intercepted those communications and then decided to release it to kind of say, hey, this is who Witkoff really is. Maybe it rattled Witkoff and he's understanding that now everybody, if he didn't see it before, which was insane, but now much more so than before, now it's maybe he's trying to portray this, look, I'm not a Russian lapdog. I'm going to negotiate in good faith with the Ukrainians. This readout is way better. Look, when the Russians and Witkoff ended their meeting in Moscow, we didn't really get a readout. It was a couple points that basically said we didn't agree to anything. And it was, quote unquote, a constructive conversation. And that's it. This, on the other hand, really hits a lot of points that the Ukrainians were saying. Okay, yes, to your point, obviously the economic piece and all that, and they probably want a piece of the pie. Great. But, you know, putting the onus on Russia. Hey, they have to show commitment to trying to reach a ceasefire, number one. Very positive. Put the blame on Russia, kind of what Marco Rubio is saying. You got to blame the aggressor, not the aggressor. You know, the guy who's doing the invasion, not the victim. So number one, putting the blame on Russia. Number two, defense capabilities and deterrence capabilities, right, for sustaining peace. Okay, that's a very positive outcome. Very amicable long-term recovery projects. And again, so I think this readout, maybe that Bloomberg article and kind of the press and maybe congressional pressure, et cetera, really got to Witkoff and say, okay, maybe it's time to acknowledge that it's the Russians. Again, it's just one post. We'll see how this continues on. But it's a post in the right direction. At the end of the day, if there's somebody who's looking at this from a Ukrainian perspective, this is a post that is basically aligned with Ukrainians' demands. And I think that's a very positive aspect in this. And maybe the Ukrainians now know how to, just as they know how Zelensky knows how to deal with President Trump, maybe we're seeing the Ukrainian delegation have a better understanding in how to negotiate with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and maybe try to get more of their demands taken much more seriously within this administration. And hopefully that reaches up to the top as well.
I just don't see, like, I understand what you're saying in regards to that, but I say it in the sense of, like, previously Witkoff's statements have always been kind of alluding to, like, literally nothing at all. And, like, this one kind of appeases everybody the way it's written, but if you read the last half of it, it's all focused on the economic development, which is the only thing at the end of the day that I truly believe he actually gives a fuck about. Like, I don't think he gives a fuck about
yeah, but Christian, let's say this. Let's say Ukraine says, let's say, okay, Steve Witkoff, all you guys, all your friends, you make all the money. Just pick our side. Just give us weapons. Let's force the Russians out. Look, it sounds terrible. But in the end of the day,
well, no, I don't just care. At the end of the day, no. But it circles back to the whole conversations we had on the first two episodes that we did on this, which is like the Russians aren't going to agree to any terms the Ukrainians have. Right? Like, Ukraine's not just going to give up territory they currently hold in the appeasement of Russia to stop a war. It's just not going to happen. especially when Ukraine knows that if they can continue fighting and continue fighting on a good stance, that they might actually legitimately win this war. As the Russian economy crumbles and the military complex starts to crumble as well. Like at the end of the day, like, yeah, like I don't like to live in a world where I believe that the Trump admin's fully on the side of Russia, but like point has not been proven otherwise thus far. You know what I mean? Like if all the steps are currently lining with them being pretty pro-Russian at this point. So I don't believe in a world where Ukraine's like, you know what, fuck it. We'll give up the 4 oblasts. We'll disarm between here and the middle of our country east, and we'll create that buffer zone they want. And you know what? They can have all of our access to the Black Sea as well. Basically have all of Odessa. Why not? You know, Crimea. We'll move all of our forces there. We'll disarm all of our drones. Okay. Yeah. Witkoff, you guys can have all the reconstruction now. At the end of the day, the only reconstruction that needs to happen for the most part within Ukraine is in the fucking east, which is the contentious territories that currently exist. So like all of the reconstruction money that could exist, at least for, if we're looking like dollar for dollar, it makes more sense for Witkoff to be on the side of Russia if he knows that the only peace plan they'll take is Ukraine giving up territories that is destitute, you know? I mean, that's just how I'm looking at it. But at the end of the day, like all the steps currently, like everything's pointing in the direction of, you know, it appears that Kushner and Witkoff are pretty pro-Russia. And like, if we look again, early before, even during like 2014, 2015, Trump had flown to Moscow. Russia wanted Trump to win the 2016 election, 2015, 2016 presidential election. They did it. They got it. They won. Perfect. Like they got what they wanted. Trump wanted to fucking literally had like Russian developers come in. I mean, if you guys really want like the whole backstory behind this, like Jared Kushner is the worst fucking person to be put in this position in any regard. In any regard, the entire Kushner real estate development company that his family owns was literally facing bankruptcy in 2013, 2014, 2015. The only reason that their family didn't lose all of their money and all of their real estate portfolio is because one of Putin's friends literally invested into his company and put it afloat. That is the only reason the Kushner family still has money. Tell me that there isn't any like, you owe me this, you owe me that, that's being played here. I cannot believe that there's a world in which, again, Kushner and Witkoff are going into the situation completely just in the eyes of, okay, US interests historically have been this is what society will do, this is what's helpful to the world, this is what will promote peace. I just don't fucking believe that. I don't believe that scenario today. I don't believe that scenario 10 years ago. I don't believe that scenario 10 years from now. Like, I don't see a world in which there isn't an already too much collusion for Witkoff and Kushner to back themselves out of the picture some and be like, you know what, this is the best interest for Ukraine. This is the best interest for the United States, best interest for Europe. I just don't see that. Like, they have too much personal skin in the game for the side of Russia. And that's just, again, it's not just an opinion. People can go and research the Kushner companies and how they were bailed out by Russia. Like it is fucking blatantly obvious what side they're on in this fight. It's just for them, I can see the pushback on like not losing the midterms, not losing political sway here in the United States, etc., on playing this sort of like trilateral fucking, like this post they just made, like it's very written in a way where it's like, yeah, most of the writing here is in complete regards to just fucking rebuilding Ukraine. Cool. But like the rest of it's just the normal shit they always say. Oh, we're working towards the Ling. Is Russia serious? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, they're fucking serious enough for you to invite them to Alaska, right? Like that's your belief. You're serious enough to fucking listen to them every fucking week when they have a new peace point that you're like, yeah, I guess we can do that. We can try to get the Ukrainians to accommodate that. Like, it's just not, the gears aren't fucking spinning. Like, it's a very low IQ take, in my opinion, to be like, yeah, maybe Kushner and Witkoff do have the interest of the American people, and they do care about what Ukraine says, and that's how they're going to enrich themselves. I just see them playing this out in a sense where like it gets dragged out so long that either the Ukrainians just agree to it and they have another fucking Budapest memorandum again, and it's just that exact scenario where it's like, okay, yeah, give up this, and this. Ukraine and Russia will agree to not hurt you. And then fucking 10 years from now, they're just going to renege on that. And we're going to be in a spot where it's like, okay, what the fuck was that all about? But I yield my time.
No, I mean, I think that's a good point, and that's kind of what I was trying to allude to earlier, is the conflict of interest is undeniable, in my opinion, unacceptable. And this is why you don't put people who can't get security clearances, probably couldn't pass the Foreign Service Officer test, in charge of negotiations. That, like, point blank. And so I don't think overnight, I don't think we're going to see Witkoff gain the ability to manage these negotiations in a meaningful way. At least not the ability to get an outcome that is beneficial to the United States in the long term, beneficial to Ukraine, and beneficial to our allies. He is being dog walked by Putin. And I think the only way we see this improve is if someone like Rubio is able to take the reins. And we talked a little bit about what that might look like. And if he did, it would be historic in that it would be the first time a chief archivist was leading major negotiations for a peace deal.
Yeah, I see what you did there, Matthew. The Secretary of State Marco Rubio has a lot of titles within this administration. I don't think that one is a key important one for him at this current moment. So we shall see. I think this has been a long running series that we do, and I kind of joked at the beginning that we can kind of put all the previous episodes into one and push it here. But we did see some major differences between the previous ones, and I think the key one is the role of Marco Rubio, and maybe the patience with Steve Witkoff is not unlimited, and we shall see what is going on with that. And this readout is interesting. We'll see they're continuing to have negotiations. One of the key aspects that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are very worried about is the United States says they're going to give them security commitments. What does that actually look like in reality? So we shall see what that means. And I think the issue of the territorial concessions that the Russians are demanding has, at least for now, it appears to have been put on hold, and that would require further negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But the Russians have made it abundantly clear that they're not interested in talking. So this is one of the areas that we'll probably have more episodes on. Maybe we'll just have it with the continuation of the negotiations, or because another magical peace plan comes out of thin air and it's just another massive pro-Russian talking point. But with that, I want to thank Christian and Matthew for joining us in this long-running series of the never-ending groundhog negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. Again, we'll probably have this again. But with that, I want to thank all of our listeners. This has been The Bottom Line Up Front on Artorias Podcast.